stop making fluffy content. Stop scaling content when you don't need to. Just make things that are concise. Make sure the formatting and structure of the piece is actually there. Read more about journalistic editorial guidelines. Like maybe look at what the FT think about guidelines when they're writing content, or other top publishers, and try and get as high up in standards as possible, because the lower end standard, the filling something just for the sake of filling something. So I don't know, let's take the death of the browser as a good topic, right? Maybe I could write about that in 500 words, but don't force me to write 1,200 words for the sake of making it a bit longer. If I only have 500 words to talk about it, then that's it. It's concise, it's well structured, it has its points, and it answers some questions that can then be synthesized into an answer. Hi, I'm Alex Moss, and this is SEO in 2026.
Alex, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
Be concise and raise the game of your editorial standards is what I would say is the best tip for 2026.
Why be concise? Because obviously we've perhaps lived through the era of creating as much content as possible. So why is being concise and perhaps less content nowadays more important?
Well, machines now and LLMs and agents, they're all ingesting content using tokenization. The more tokenization that's used, the more processing power is required. And therefore, it's kind of like the content version of site performance and site speed at this point, you know? If there's a slow loading site, then it's going to take a while for people to load, which might impact UX and other metrics such as, CTR and things like that. But when it comes to content for content's sake, which is a good phrase you use because that was a bit of an old and grey hat technique of just scaling content and just doing any old thing to get as much exposure and as many keywords as possible. But now, being a bit too detailed doesn't always help. I think the key here now is to just, when I say be concise, is don't blabber on too much, I would say is the informal way of saying it. I think another good example is, and I'm sure you'll have found it too, especially with tech or startup kind of sites, you go to the about page and like what we do, and you may read 4 sentences and you still don't know what they do. They talk it like they use very colorful words, fluffy kind of stuff, salesy words to impress the human. But right now, the audience is not just a human. Machines are the audience as well. And they're ingesting that content and they don't get sold by that kind of language. They get sold by direct language, things that get to the point, answer the questions, solve a problem. And that, I think, is the way in which content in general should be going. And I think we've let ourselves down maybe over the last few years by lowering the standards of editorial in general so that anyone could potentially make content for content's sake. And I think this is a very good thing because it'll take away content mediocrity and raise those standards, not just in general content of everyday sites that we all work on, but even as far as, journalistic and editorial online. We'll have to make sure that they're adapting to higher standards in order to have the best exposure.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of letting ourselves down, I think we've just been chasing the algorithm because, 10 years ago, we used to be able to say, okay, write a 500-word article or a 500 or a 1,000-word article that includes this keyword phrase in it and make sure you multiply, add some LSI keywords or related keywords and do it for $20. That's what I'm looking for. And I'm going to publish that once a day. And that worked. That could get you onto the top page of Google, but it doesn't work nowadays. And it's hard not to do something if it works.
Yeah, and I think before everyone was not only chasing the algorithm, but let's face it, someone just trying to find a loophole and exploit the loophole in order to rank, gain visibility, and get some extra sales or conversions. And whilst that's good in the short term, it's just a black hat technique. It's low end automation at scale. And we've seen enough over this year in 2025 of people trying to scale content with AI. And, the thing that annoys me is on X, sometimes you'll have someone going, oh, I scaled up content and look at this graph that's going up. Isn't this great? And I favorite them because I check in about 6 months later and see how it's going. And not one of them are still gaining momentum or growing. They've all been penalized in some way, or whatever scale they've done has to be scaled back because it just hasn't worked in the long term.
So what happens if you work for a business that has a lot of content that's been publishing for the last 10 or 15 years or so? Is the first step to actually review the existing content that they have and prune a lot of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of sounds quite familiar when HCU first started out, right? There was a lot of content cleaning, like, bringing some pages together. If you've got like 5 pages that are kind of covering the same-ish thing, but you were doing it for content's sake back in the day, maybe now it's better to consolidate those things into one long-form piece of content. Again, that's more editorially concise because you would take away some repetition and some filibustering in there just to pad out words and try and fill some keyword structure. But now it's not just about how many keywords and how many words and clustering, things like that. It's not just about that. And internal linking has always been important, but it's even more important now for the flow of LLMs as well. And to make maybe not just a complete pyramid shape that keeps on going down and down and down to 7, 8, 9 levels, but maybe flattening out your IA a little bit more so it's easier for a machine to navigate as well as a human. And that works with content as well, making it a bit more flatter in terms of not going into some topic and then subtopic and subtopic of that and subtopic of that. Not many people can do that in a legitimate and concise way. So bringing that together and also removing any content that is a waste of time, really, to the internet as a whole is going to be a good thing. Because it is kind of, I would say some of it's like web spam. I've been talking a bit like this year about, you remember, I'm sure everyone knows about the Coldplay concert where those 2 people were caught cheating. And the internet for the next 4 weeks was just full of it. And I thought that was a lot of web spam. As soon as you've got like 3 or 4 publications talk about it, you don't need, and then that annoying thing of brands started doing their own take on the comedic level of things. That to me is just a waste of time. And to an agent and to an LLM is also a little bit of a waste of time as well. You just need to understand the source, what happened, and synthesize an answer. But we go over the top to try and get those visits and try and get some of the conversion going on. And I just don't think it's going to work as easily that way in the future, in the longer term as well.
So talking about LLMs, you also say structure your content as if an LLM's your primary reader. So what does actually mean, that actually mean in practice in terms of what you actually do to your content structure?
Well, firstly, and it would be obvious anyway, and I'm sure not just me, but a bunch of SEOs have been saying it in the past, like make sure all of those H1, H2s are all in there, but it goes a little bit beyond that. Anything that can add formatting to text that may be relevant inside. I know it sounds weird, but things like italics and bold and table structure is all quite important now because LLMs ingest that. They're not just reading words, they'll understand those things. They also read a lot of markdown as well. So if you may be in a niche where you're in a more technical vertical, then it may be more useful to make markdown versions of that because that's what LLMs love. I think it's the one thing that's a bit unanimous in the world of AI is that LLMs like to ingest markdown more so than any other output, including markup, which, to be fair, is kind of markdown that's been made to be more appealing on the human eye. But again, the human eye isn't the only thing looking at our content anymore. There's a robot looking at it and they look at things. And again, when it comes to tokenization, markdown and good structure helps the tokenization. And you can go to, I think there's a tokenizer, OpenAI have their own tokenizer, and you can like try it out for free when you copy and paste words, and it shows you and highlights the way in which it tokenizes things. And that's a good calculator, and you can use that as a good test. So being able to reduce the amount of processing power that an LLM would have to do to ingest all the content on a given page or a given site is going to be advantageous to save as much as possible on, because LLMs, they're cheap, right? Or that's their mentality. They'll try and find the cheapest way to complete a process because that's the most efficient and cost-effective way of doing so, and fastest as well.
And you also advocate exploring and experimenting with new open standards like LLMs.txt. So what is that, and why should SEOs do that?
Well, LLMs.txt, whilst it's not standardized like robots.txt is today, or maybe an XML sitemap, it was a proposed standard written by someone who, Ryan Howard, I think it is. Ryan Howard is based in Australia. He's got one of those AI startups, and he created the proposal. And weirdly, it's to describe LLMs.txt in a nutshell, think of it as just a summary of your site with good on-site references that covers what you do, like what you're selling, what you're offering. And it's just kind of like a summary. That's all it is. But it covers everything that it needs to in order for an LLM to then dig deeper. Think of it as an open house. When you're looking at a house or a first look at a house, you go in, you can check out all like how big the house is. You can kind of gauge it, but you're not answering questions about what's inside the walls or what the roof made out of quite yet. That may be on your second visit when you delve further and investigate further into what you might want to purchase. And LLMs.txt may be a version of that. And whilst some poo-poo it maybe by saying it's the new meta keywords or it can be abused, I would counter-argue that by saying that everything can be abused in the world of the web and owning a website. And of course, if you produce your own LLMs.txt file, it will be subjective, but as long as you're honest and open in it and you're not trying to abuse the LLM to make it do something it shouldn't, then it's a legitimate thing to do. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether it should be included. And my answer to that is the longer you discuss it, the less time you're spending time on producing it. It can take you, unless of course you've got a huge site and where it would take some time to produce an LLMs.txt file. If you've got a small site, it takes about 20 minutes. And in Yoast SEO, in the free version, you can generate it automatically. So you don't have to do any editing whatsoever. And let's say you post 20 posts a day, it will dynamically update that. And whether or not a lot of LLMs out there are using it, to me, is immaterial. It's there, and I consider it some insurance, because the moment that one LLM may do it, and I'm not saying that anyone's at the forefront of doing it, if one just says, you know what, we're going to do it right now, everyone who has been criticizing LLMs.txt will very quickly shut up, and they'll also very quickly implement that idea. Meanwhile, me and everyone who's got Yoast SEO who's enabled it already have it there. So it's just a form of insurance. It's there just because, and it's there because it's an additional bit of help should someone need it or something need it.
And in relation to that, why should SEOs work with MCPs?
Oh, well, I guess that's a different question to LLMs.txt, but MCPs...
Yeah, new technology, new standards, and obviously, yeah.
Yeah, for an SEO, I'd say the best way of using MCPs is to connect data and be able to interact with it in a more conversational level and be able to understand big data in a way that you don't have to be, a super advanced data analyst. You can ask it questions, it can analyze that data, and then it can bring you back in again in a natural language manner that you can then understand more and ask more questions. So, for example, you can connect Search Console's MCP to Claude or Perplexity, and I think OpenAI do it now. I'm sure they do it now. You connect it, it's like putting in a USB stick into your hard drive of the LLM, and now it has all of that extra data. In a previous talk, I compared it to in the first Matrix when they were trying to escape on the roof, and Trinity needed knowledge on how to operate a helicopter in order to escape. So the pilot on Nebuchadnezzar outside the Matrix literally uploaded all of that knowledge directly into her brain in like that, and then all of a sudden she knew exactly how to work and operate the helicopter. It's kind of like that. It's like uploading all of that data and knowledge into a larger LLM so it could contextually understand that data and interact with you on it. And you can do not just Search Console, but Google Analytics now have one. I don't think SEMrush do, but Ahrefs do. Systrix has one. And then you can connect all of those things and ask it questions about multiple things. And I think that's a really good thing, because then it can also maybe answer questions that are meant for more non-data focused people, maybe more in the marketing team. In the content team, they may find it useful. For example, what was working this time last year during Black Friday? What made the most conversions? What were the biggest pages that were attracted this year that maybe I could use? What didn't work? And it can read the data and it can analyze it. And as well as that, you can upload your own data. So let's say, for example, you had a Shopify shop, and in there, you could export all of your orders and then upload it as a document and then ask it questions about the order whilst correlating it with anything that the MCP is connected to.
It sounds like because these machines will be able to make sense of so much data, so much content, that there might be a chance that it's not necessary to be quite so concise with content moving forwards. Do you think that might be the case? Do you think the fact that we need to be concise now is a relatively short-lived requirement in order to actually be more likely to rank higher, and that in the next few years perhaps longer content might come into fashion again?
It might, but again, long content can still be concise. It's like research papers, highly detailed research papers if they're 20,000 words, it's not like saying that 8,000 of them is fluff around the 12,000 important words in there. It's still all concise and structured and done so. Like white papers are a good example of keeping to an agenda, not diverting too much away, not waffling too much, which is what I do verbally. It stays on track and stays in its lane. And again, that's ingested in a better way. But in the long term, things are unpredictable, right? Like, I've had conversations with some people internally in Yoast, an engineer, who is convincing me more that the browser may die in the next few years. And that's an interesting thing, because the browser is made to bridge a gap between the content and styling and the human who's looking at it. But now that a machine might be the primary audience of who looks at your site in the next couple of years, I'm now thinking that websites may, and especially going back to Markdown, think of a Kindle. You've got a Kindle file, you can put 10,000 books onto this one device, and it's output in a very flat way. It's text, but it's got all the formatting with it to go with it. But they're just text files. That's essentially Markdown. And I believe that that's what apps and LLMs may turn into, is a Kindle management service for the open web, where they pull information off on a more basic level and then merge that with media, for example, that you may have inside. But I don't think humans are going to be looking at websites in the same way that we have been. And I think that's a shift that we're all going to have to adapt to in the next couple of years, perhaps. This is theoretical, right? The browser may be a long-lived another 25 years, but I just believe that the way we're ingesting content and sites and searching for things and discovering things at the moment, whilst it's in stepping stones, is going to change in the longer term.
Interesting answer. And I liked your thoughts about no fluff in content. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't have lengthy pieces, but as long as if it's not padded out with lots of fluff. And it kind of reminds me of the answer that I have when people ask me what's the best length for a podcast episode, as if there's a magic number, 20 minutes, 25 minutes or something like that. You can say that, okay, the average commute is this amount, so maybe you should aim for that. But generally my answer is as long as it needs to be. It could be, a nice, concise 10-minute episode is enough for the message that you want to convey. But it could also be the fact that a 2-hour long discussion is appropriate for the conversation that you're having. Consistency is best in terms of what audience has in terms of expectations, but there's no definitive answer necessarily. It depends on the message that you want to convey, and that applies to written content as well.
Yeah, which is also interesting because long-form podcast interviews are a trend right now. And they're very long, some of them. I think there was a recent interview with Lex Friedman and someone, and it was 10 hours. And in my head, I'm like, how do you even sit and talk for 10 hours? That is a feat within itself. Then you've got to think of, well, who's going to listen for those 10 full hours? Probably not everyone, unless you're very, very, very focused on that interview. And then you'll get summaries, or you'll get chop and changing, and I don't know, now that things are in chapters on YouTube, you may only be interested in certain segments of the interview. And again, LLMs will be able to take the transcript, they'll be able to take the chapters. Soon they'll probably be able to understand like mood and identify sarcasm, things like that can, again, add to it. But whilst a long-form podcast is kind of fluffy, isn't it? Because you can talk about all sorts. You also get unadulterated content with long-form podcasting. So if we were talking now for 3 hours, I think we'd go into much more granular detail about things because we have that time. Here, this one may be 30 to 60 minutes, and therefore we have limited time. So again, I can't go on too long. You'd have to control me. Otherwise, we'd be here for 3 hours talking about really detailed stuff. But again, it's about just being concise, getting to the point, and LLMs will, even from a long-form podcast, will soon be better and better and better at understanding what the summary is and where things are important. And more so, once we get to connections, how it's connecting us and our personalities, things like Google Drive and it understands more and more about us, it'll probably be able to understand, of those 10 hours, which of the bits of that 10-hour interview with Lex Fridman is actually applicable to me. What am I going to find interesting based on what you know and what you've seen I've been doing with my browsing history and Gmail activity? And I think that's going to be really cool. But it also makes it much harder for us lot as SEOs, because personalization is the norm now. You know, I remember PWS equals 0 on Google. And when personalization started, you wanted to check the ranking of something, you would go to whatever the search term was on Google and you would just add the UTM PWS equals 0. And that meant that personalization is disabled and you would see completely different rankings. But that, again, people aren't talking about that because no one's got depersonalization anymore, to the point that even on OpenAI, you can have 0 account activity. You can be logged out. You can prompt or ask the same thing as me and we'll get a different result. That's how personalized it is. There's nothing flat anymore, and it makes it much, much harder to attribute what to rankings. It makes it much, much harder for rank tracking to be more accurate and more valuable. You know, everything's up in the air in the next couple of years, I'd say.
The shortening tail, echo chambers, the conversation could go much deeper on this particular topic. Hopefully some other time soon. But let's be definitive about things in terms of a takeaway. So Alex, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
Stop making fluffy content. Stop scaling content when you don't need to. Just make things that are concise. Make sure the formatting and structure of the piece is actually there. Read more about journalistic editorial guidelines. Like maybe look at what the FT think about guidelines when they're writing content, or other top publishers, and try and get as high up in standards as possible, because the lower end standard, the filling something just for the sake of filling something. So I don't know, let's take the death of the browser as a good topic, right? Maybe I could write about that in 500 words, but don't force me to write 1,200 words for the sake of making it a bit longer. If I only have 500 words to talk about it, then that's it. It's concise, it's well structured, it has its points, and it answers some questions that can then be synthesized into an answer.
Alex Moss is a principal SEO at Yoast and co-founder of Firecask. Find out more over at alex-moss.co.uk. Alex, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thank you very much.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at seoin2026.com.